Hey y'all, welcome back to another episode of our How to Start Your Own Sourdough Starter series. Thank you, Jesus. It is another beautiful day to be in the kitchen. Now, today I want to talk about maintaining your starter. And this is really important because we've gone over the basics of what is a starter, how to start a starter, what flours work for your starter, and we've also covered the first basics of how to bake your very first loaf of sourdough bread with your new starter. Now, you need to know how to maintain your starter because once you've got it established, you want to keep it alive so you can continue to keep it. So whenever you want to use it, your starter is ready to go and you can then proceed to continuously bake your own loaves of sourdough bread. Now, the first thing you want to do is once you've used your starter to make your loaf of sourdough bread, the first thing you want to do is go ahead and feed your starter again. So you've used it, now it's time to feed it because you can't do anything with it until you feed it regardless. It needs to be fed after each use. Now, if you're going to keep your starter on the counter and say you want to bake daily, or because there are many things that you can bake with your sourdough starter. It's not just sourdough bread. You can do sourdough biscuits. You can do sourdough rolls. You can do sourdough Belgian waffles, which we love. You can stir sourdough into soups. It'll be like the thickener for your soup. You can use it to make muffins. You can use it to make bagels. You can use it. There are so many different things. You can use it to make pizza. So the first thing we want to decide is how do we want to use our starter? Are we going to be using it daily? Or are we going to be using it weekly? Or are we going to be using it on a monthly basis? Meaning, okay, I know I want to bake maybe twice a month. So if you are a daily sourdough user, you're going to feed your sourdough every day. And that means once you use it and you've portioned off the bit that you need for your recipe, you just go ahead and feed it, put it on the counter, and let it rise and all, and then you use it again. If you're going to be just a weekly sourdough baker, meaning you're baking throughout the week, my suggestion, the best way to maintain it, because you want to maintain your starter in a way where you don't have a lot of discard. And that's what a lot of people think, oh, I've got to have so much discard. You don't. And you don't need a lot of sourdough, by the way, to bake. I can take this amount of sourdough here that I have, and this amount of starter, which is probably right around 175 grams, which is fairly high because you don't need this much. This will bake maybe 40 loaves of bread, depending. You can maybe do 50 loaves of bread. You don't need a lot of starter to bake a lot of bread. So you don't need to maintain a massive starter. And that's what get most people, you see they have these big crocks of sourdough starter. You only need that if you are a person who puts your starter into just about everything you bake, and if you bake just about every single day. That's the only reason why you would need to maintain, because you're using such a volume of it constantly that you don't have time to refresh it and let it rise and then use it for your next baking project. So that's the reason why you see people maintain very large crocks of starter. I do not maintain a large starter. I used to when I baked when I baked for the bakery and the cafe, and I did sourdough bread. I baked a lot and I didn't have time. As I say, I didn't have time to feed it and let it refresh. I needed sourdough as I baked along throughout my baking, throughout my work schedule. So I didn't have time to sit back and let it and wait on it. So I needed it right away, and therefore I kept a very large crock of sourdough starter. Now, I don't do that today because I don't have to bake that volume of bread anymore. So a reasonable size starter is perfect, especially if you're a beginner. So and then back to the discard issue, because this is important. Discarding a ton of starter is not necessary. If you're finding that you're dumping sourdough starter, or you have an excessive amount of discard, you're overfeeding your starter. Either you're feeding it when you don't need to feed it, or you're feeding it too much. So the best way to avoid that is to work out, and this is very individualistic, work out how you want to use your starter, and that will tell you how you want to maintain your starter. So if you're leaving it in the fridge, that is how you maintain a starter in the fridge. Now, as far as how long you can have it in the fridge without feeding it, it's a good idea to feed your starter at least once every 2 weeks if you're not going to use it every week. Like if you're going to use it every week, then you are feeding it every week and there's no worries. But if you skip a week, you can skip a week of feeding it. Just leave it in the fridge, but you do need to pick it back up that 15th day and give it a good feed so your starter won't get too sluggish and get too sleepy, because then it'll take a lot longer to wake it back up when you all of a sudden do want to bake again. Now, as far as the whole discard issue, if you do have discard, or if you want to have discard, that's perfectly fine. Just keep your discard to a minimum, because that can become a weight on your mind. It's like, goodness, I dumped out 200 grams of discard just to have 50 grams of starter. And now I haven't to feed it again, and then that becomes a bit of a waste. So if you can feed your starter a reasonable amount of flour and water, you can avoid having a discard. Now, let's go ahead and give this starter a feed before I then place it in the fridge. So since this starter is going in the refrigerator, I'm going to go ahead and give it a full feed, which is 60 grams of flour and 60 grams of water. So I'm going to go ahead. I've already got my scale set to 0. And I am going to do that mixture of 10 grams of my rye flour and 10 grams of my all-purpose flour. So that's 50 grams of all-purpose flour. And then here we have 50 grams of all-purpose flour, sorry. And the rye flour will make sure that your sourdough starter can pick itself back up a little faster than if you just used plain all-purpose flour. Now I need 60 grams of water. So in she goes. And as you can see, this will make a little more starter, then my jar will be a little fuller. But that's fine because I bake with a considerable amount of sourdough. So the next time I use it, I'll probably use maybe most of it, leaving about a quarter of it. So stir that in. There we are. That's good. Now, I do put a lid on this because it stays in the fridge at this point. So there's no need to, you don't want to cover it with something that's porous. You do want to put a lid on this, and just screw the lid on. And I'm going to let this sit at room temperature. You don't want to put it right in the fridge right away. You kind of want to give it time to activate before you then put it to sleep in the fridge. So I'm just going to let this hang out on the counter for about maybe an hour, 2 hours. Don't let it start to just rise. Then you must give it another feed. You want to avoid doing that because we're putting it to sleep in the fridge so we can maintain the starter and it won't become like you're having so much starter. Now, to the question of if you go on vacation, should you take your starter with you? My answer to that is only if you will be using your starter while you're on vacation. If you're not, say we go on camping trips and I like to take some starter with me. I make pizzas or flatbreads or whatever, because even on camping trips, I'm still baking. But that is the only reason why you would need to take a starter with you if you're going on vacation. Depending on how long your vacation is, say for instance, you decided to take a 2-week vacation, your starter would be, if you feed it before you left, I would use it, feed it again, let it rise, and then put it in the refrigerator. You don't want to leave it unused and unfed, at least. Whether you use it or not would be entirely up to you, but you do want to discard half of it if you're not using it. Just discard half of the sourdough starter and then feed it. Let it sit at room temperature for about an hour or so. Then put it in the fridge, and it would be fine for that period of time that you're going to be gone. Now, one thing I would suggest that you do, give it a full feed. So in my first video, I talked about how you can give it a half feed, sometimes 30 grams of flour and 30 grams of water. But if you're going to put it to sleep for any amount of time, I would go ahead and give it a full feed. And as long as your vacation isn't over 3 weeks, you should be fine, provided you give it that full feed. Now, if you're going to take a break from sourdough starter, and let's talk about if you want to take a break. If you want to take a break from sourdough baking, or you just need a little bit of time to kind of brace yourself, because life happens and sometimes you can't always bake, and sometimes you don't want to be thinking about a sourdough starter. You can put your starter, you can dehydrate some of your starter. And I suggest that you do dehydrate some of your starter. You can keep it as backup. So in the pantry, I have a small jar of dehydrated starter. I keep that on hand because anything can happen. Somebody who doesn't know what it is could come in, and be like, oh, what's this? And dump it down in the trash. And then I'm like, oh, it's my starter. You don't want that to happen. And if your jar isn't labeled, as mine isn't, because nobody in my house is going to meddle with this jar. I know everybody knows what it is. So you always want to have that as a little bit of backup, because you could inadvertently kill your starter through no fault of yours. You could, make a mistake and feed it with, self-rising flour or something. By the way, it's always a good idea to keep your flours labeled so you'll know who's who. But you could inadvertently feed it with self-rising flour, or you could, your starter could just up and die on you. Anything can happen. So keeping a little bit of backup starter is good insurance for your mind, and you could just rehydrate your dehydrated starter and proceed, and you always have some backup. I also keep some backup starter in the freezer, which you can freeze it. You don't have to dehydrate any of it. You can freeze it and just put it in a little container and label it and put it in the freezer, and it'll be fine, because cold does not kill a sourdough starter. Freezing doesn't kill it. What kills it is heat, because of course once you put it in the oven and you bake it, it dies, and it's no longer active, and it won't do anything after that. Now, another type of a starter that I do want to discuss is a French style starter. It's called a pre-ferment. And what it is, you have none of this. Okay, so let's just set this aside. For this type of starter, you have none of this. And you save a very small piece of dough from a previous batch of dough. You just save off a little portion and you put it aside. Say you would keep it in the refrigerator, or you would just put it in a cool place. And you would then take this little portion of your dough, add it to the next batch of your flour and your water as you're mixing, and your salt as you're mixing. And that will act like a leavener, which it will be a leavener for another batch of dough. Same method when you're making yogurt and you save out, 2 tablespoons, add it to another batch of milk, and it adds the bacteria that turns your milk into yogurt, and you just keep that going. Now, that only works if you are baking on an everyday basis, because obviously that little ball of dough is not going to stay active just sitting there, not being used for no more than maybe a day or so. So that works for large scale bakeries that are baking daily, and they want to maintain a small amount of dough like that without having to bother with a sourdough starter. Now, the thing with that is you do need something existing to leaven that first batch of dough before you can then start pinching off little pieces of dough. And that is always mostly done with fresh yeast. The yeast from the grocery store, you can do that. I have tried it, and it does work, using pinches of dough leavened with the commercial yeast. But over a period of time, that can kind of fizzle out because there's not enough of it there. And it's also commercial yeast. It's not sourdough. So it will only go for a couple of times and then it kind of loses its oomph. And the thing of it is, the only way you know it's lost its oomph is when your dough doesn't rise. So that is another type of method. And that's also a very old-fashioned method that bakers, especially in the early days of settler period, you would have women who would save little batches of little balls of dough from baking, and they would just add that to the next. But those ladies were usually baking every day, and that's why they were able to do that. And it was cheap. It was free yeast, and there was no constant feeding of starters and all of those kinds of things. So that's another way that you can do it. But as I say, that method only works if you know you're baking every single day. So I hope this video on how to maintain your sourdough starter is useful to you and it's helpful. And as usual, if you got any questions whatsoever, please leave a comment and share your thoughts, share your questions, and I will be more than happy to answer you guys with any help that I can. So until I make another episode on sourdough baking, the good Lord willing, I will see you guys again in another video. Take care, y'all, and happy sourdough baking. Bye.